what about Poland? You just spoke about Poland. There is
Sure.
also a society that seems to be quite divided and polarized. Or is that exaggerated?
Poland is like a big family, and family quarrels are the toughest because everybody knows everybody else. There is an anger and bitterness to Polish politics, which goes back to the breakup of the Solidarity movement in 1989 and the way that communism was overthrown and disagreements about that. So it is bitter and you can see it. So that's one side of Poland. The other side is that they have worked a miracle since 1989. I mean, it's more than a generation of democracy and prosperity. Poland in 1989 was a desperately poor country, and it is not a poor country. There are poor people in it still, but
the economy
is
doing extremely well.
And it still is. They've had, I think, maybe 6 months of recession since 1992, when the economy bottomed out at the worst period of the post-communist transformation. Even during the Great Recession, the Poles were still growing. Turns out Poles are awfully good entrepreneurs. And there's a story behind this. So you have success, divided politics, and yet a consensus among not 100%, but sort of 80% consensus in Poland about some key strategic issues, which is more than I can say for the United States. Pro-NATO, pro-US, pro-transatlantic, pro-Ukraine for strategic reasons. They're divided about support for Ukrainians, and that's a separate discussion if you want it, and suspicion of Russia. Look, as we're speaking, there is a senior Polish parliamentary delegation in Washington, which is bipartisan. Not only is it bipartisan, you have the head of it is part of the ruling Liberal Party, who's also has a second hat as a special envoy in Ukraine, and somebody from the Nationalist Law and Justice Party is going to be the new president's foreign affairs advisor. And they are working together, and they are saying the same things on key issues. Like, you can't tell who's who. So you're absolutely right that Polish politics is bitter and divided, and Polish society is divided, and yet they can pull together on the key issues and do the bipartisan thing.
And they've been stalwart on Ukraine overall.
They have been magnificent on Ukraine, despite the many complications of Polish-Ukrainian history. They have done a lot. And there is a consensus in Poland that Ukraine's success is in Poland's strategic interest. There are some in Poland who are irritated with the Ukrainians on a bunch of issues and think that the Ukrainians are insufficiently grateful to the Poles, who have done a hell of a lot for them, including taking in over 1 million Ukrainian refugees. And you know how many Ukrainians ended up in camps? 0. Why? Because Poles took them into their homes. 1 million people in a country less than 40 million. Now, do the numbers. It's a complicated history. And wise Poles and Ukrainians will tell you privately, when we have fought, dating back to the old wars between the Polish nobility and the Ukrainian Cossacks, when we fought, Moscow benefits. So can we learn? Can we knock it off? Stop? But this is a long and complicated issue. But the Poles have emerged as a first-tier European power, not least because they were right about Russia, and not only that, they are known to have been right about Russia. And I can't tell you how many times the Germans would patronize the Poles, saying, oh, they're emotional, oh, they're prisoners of their history, oh, they're just Russophobes. Yeah, okay. Except they were right, weren't they, about Nord Stream 2, about Russian ambitions.
There's been a sea change in Germany, too.
Which I welcome. And it took a while, but I'm not going to knock the Germans. They were wrong about Russia. Well, weren't we? For a while, huh?
George W. Bush.
Look, I served in that administration. George W. Bush understood that he had a problem with Putin much earlier than people realized. And it was reasonable for him to try to work with Putin because we didn't know. Having said that, yeah, our Russia policy in the Bush administration toward Putin, which I had a hand in designing, was based on incorrect assumptions. So it failed. But it was an honorable failure, by which I mean when we realized that the assumptions were wrong, that Putin was demanding too much, we made the correct decisions. And it's very interesting. Bill Clinton, whose NSC I also served, said something very similar. He was in Prague a little over a year ago, and he said his Russia policy failed and a Central European policy succeeded. He was right to enlarge NATO. He was right to try to work with Russia. But he said that part didn't work out. Not sorry I tried, but he was perfectly frank and not defensive. Which, if you think about it, if two presidents as different as Clinton and Bush went through the same learning curve on Russia, it leads to suspicion that the issue really isn't the Americans. The issue is what the Russians were demanding.
They were steeped in grievances, and Putin believes that the end of the Cold War was a new Treaty of Versailles. Which is why I think your Hitler analogy is actually quite apposite.
Well, I was in the Clinton administration in the 90s, and we kept saying to ourselves, we must avoid a punitive peace like Versailles, and we must avoid having post-Soviet Russia be Weimar Russia. We used that language.
Right.
Did we impose reparations on Russia? No. Did we shun them? No. We helped them, gave them assistance, started bringing them into the institutions. The one thing we didn't do, and there's a whole school of thought that says it's our fault, is that we didn't allow them to keep their empire. The issue of NATO enlargement, and full disclosure, I'm one of the authors of that policy. The purpose of that policy was to unite Europe. And the opponents of it, and they were about 90% of the foreign policy establishment when I came back to Washington in 93, their argument was it'll upset Russia. And the trouble with that argument, and the reason Clinton, who started out there, didn't end up there, is because think through the consequences. We won the Cold War largely because East European pro-democracy, patriotic movements overthrew communism, and that helped bring down the Soviet Union. And now we're going to tell them that, well, never mind, you belong to Moscow anyway? How does that help build a post-Cold War Europe by maintaining the line of the Cold War, which is what the opponents of NATO enlargement wanted to do? How much do we owe Russia? Oh, and by the way, in case you're tempted to fall for the nonsense that NATO was a big military threat to Russia, we combined NATO enlargement with A, NATO-Russia relationship, and B, assurances that we would not build up our heavy military combat infrastructure near Russia, and C, we drew down American forces.
We did all those things.
We did all those things. We kept our word. And there are still people who write that it was all our fault.
But they argued that during the Cold War, too.
Yes, they did.
And had we only been more conciliatory towards Stalin, then the Cold War need never have begun. This is an old argument.
Yes, it's the blame America first argument. Russia has no responsibility. And I was listening to a European leftist talk about how we imposed on Russia's strategic space. Okay, Ukraine's not a country. It's strategic space.
Right.
Poland's not a country.
Yeah. Zone of hegemony.
Yeah, and that's not just hegemony, that's hegemony Russian style. And that means in practice, and we know this, people in boxcars going in the wrong direction. And many of them don't come back.
Right.
Okay? You buy on to a Russian sphere of influence, you're buying onto that. You think that's just 1940? That's Ukraine now. You better own it, buddy, is what I would say to the realists. It's all abstract fun and games for you. It's somebody else. It's somebody else's life. But then again, as Solzhenitsyn once wrote, how does someone warm understand someone cold?
Final question.
Yes.
President Trump has a brain flash. Call and says, I need to see Ambassador Dan Fried
Unlikely.
in the Oval Office.
Unlikely.
He does. Late at night. What's the one piece of advice you would give him about Ukraine?
Win. And all of our other problems get better. I would say, you're worried about China? Some people, Mr. President, tell you if we help Ukraine, it weakens us in the Pacific. If we lose in Ukraine, it emboldens Xi. If we help the Ukrainians beat back the Russians, all of our problems get better, including in Asia. But ask the Japanese, South Koreans, and the Taiwanese. That's what they think too. And I would then say, Mr. President, you are absolutely right to push the Europeans to do more. You've won the argument. Keep pushing. Make them deliver. But now you're set up to make America great in the world. The free world is not freeloading. It works for us. It's the American way, Mr. President, make the world a better place and get really, really rich. Because it works for everybody. That's the genius of our policy, and if you do that, you'll be up there along with Harry Truman and Kennedy and Reagan.
You may remember that Reagan's line when he was with his advisors as he was preparing to campaign to win the presidency in 1980. They came to him with all kinds of convoluted proposals on the Soviet Union. And he said, gentlemen, I have a simpler solution. We win, they lose.
Reagan, I recommend Max Boot's biography of Reagan. And one of the themes in that biography is how Reagan never quite loses all of his intellectual DNA from his youth, which was a Wilsonian, Rooseveltian, Harry Truman Democrat. He was right-wing, but he also believed in freedom, democracy, and the power of liberation. He believed America fought World War II not just to be a dominating power, but to have a better world, not because we were stupid, naive idealists, but because that was going to suit our bottom line. Make the world a better place and get really rich doing so. That's the American way.
Dan, thank you very much.
My pleasure.